What was the diet of worms?
In 1521 a diet, which is another word for an imperial council or an assembly of princes, was convened at Worms, situated on the Rhine River in Germany. This particular meeting had been called by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, 1500–1558, to consider the crisis that had been brought on by the Reformation. Since Martin Luther, 1483–1546, was instrumental in both igniting the movement and furthering its causes, he was called before the Diet to testify and defend himself. But the religious leader refused to yield his stance. He vowed to continue to make his argument against the Church. He closed his statement with these famous words, "Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. God help me. Amen." The result of this was that on May 25 the Edict of Worms was issued, declaring Martin Luther an outlaw. However, Luther sought refuge in the protection of Frederick the Wise, and the edict itself served only to galvanize the cause of the reformers.
What is Plato's theory of forms?
The theory, or doctrine, of forms, also called the theory of ideas, is Greek philosopher Plato's, c. 428–347 BC, expression of his belief that there are forms that exist outside the material realm, and therefore are unchanging. They do not come into existence, change, or pass out of existence. It is these ideas that, according to Plato, are the objects or essence of knowledge. Further, he posited that the body, the seat of appetite and passion, which communes with the physical world, rather than the world of ideas or forms, is inferior to the intellect. He believed the physical aspect of human beings to be irrational, while the intellect, or reason, was deemed to be rational. The origins of Plato's theory can be traced to Socrates, c. 470–399 BC, who believed that the psyche, inner spirit, has intuitive access to divinely known principles or truths, which he attempted to formulate through his conversations with others. Indeed, the Socratic dialogues, written by Plato, reveal that Socrates was striving to define the exact nature of the traditional Greek moral virtues of piety, temperance, and courage.
Who was Hoyle?
Edmund Hoyle, 1671 or 1672–1769, was an English card player who, in 1742 at the age of 70, published short treatise on whist, which provided the rules for a game that developed into auction bridge and later into contract bridge. Hoyle's name has survived among bridge players in the phrase "according to Hoyle."
Who invented the computer?
English mathematician Charles Babbage, 1792 to 1871, is recognized as the first to conceptualize the computer. He worked to develop a mechanical computing machine called the analytical engine, which is considered the prototype of the digital computer. While attending Cambridge University in 1812, Babbage conceived of the idea of a machine that could calculate data faster than could humans and without human error. These were the early years of the Industrial Revolution, and the world Babbage lived in was growing increasingly complex. Human errors in mathematical tables posed serious problems for many burgeoning industries. After graduating from Cambridge, Babbage returned to the idea of a computational aid. He spent the rest of his life and much of his fortune trying to build such a machine. But he was not to finish. Nevertheless, Babbage's never completed analytical engine, on which he began work in 1834, was the forerunner of the modern digital computer. A programmable electronic device that stores, retrieves, and processes data. Babbage's device used punch cards to store data and was intended to print answers. More than 100 years later, the first fully automatic calculator was invented. Development began in 1939 at Harvard University. Under the direction of mathematician Howard Aiken, 1900 to 1973, the first electronic digital computer, called Mark I, was invented in 1944. The Mark II followed in 1947. In 1946, scientists at the University of Pennsylvania completed ENIAC, Electronic Numerical Integrator and Calculator, the first all-purpose electronic digital computer. Operating on 18,000 vacuum tubes, ENIAC was large, required great deal of power to run, and generated a lot of heat. The first computer to handle both numeric and alphabetical data with equal facility was the UNIVAC. Universal Automatic Computer, developed between 1946 and 1951, also at the University of Pennsylvania.
How long have trains been in use?
Trains date as far back as the 16th century, when crude railroads operated in the underground coal and iron ore mines of Europe. These systems consisted of two wooden rails that extended into the mines and across the mine floors. Wheeled wagons were pulled along the rails by men or by horses. Early in the 18th century, mining companies expanded on this rail system, bringing it above ground to transport the coal and iron ore. Workers found that they could cover the wooden rails with iron so they wouldn't wear out as quickly. Before long, rails were made entirely of iron. Meanwhile, the steam engine had been developed. An engineer in the mines of Cornwall, England, Richard Trevithick, 1771 to 1833, constructed a working model of a locomotive engine in 1797. 3 years later, he built the first high-pressure steam engine. He made quick progress from there, building a road carriage. which on Christmas Eve 1801 became the first vehicle to convey passengers by steam. 2 years later, the inventor had built the world's first steam railway locomotive. In 1825, progress in rail transportation was made by another English inventor, George Stephenson, 1781 to 1848, who, after patenting his own locomotive engine, 1815, finished construction on the world's first public railroad. The train ran a distance of about 20 miles, conveying passengers from Stockton to Darlington, England. In 1830, Stephenson completed a line between Liverpool and Manchester. Rail travel caught on quickly and remains an efficient means of transport today, with commuters around the world relying on trains to get them to work each day. While Stephenson went on to build more railways, and build a family business in the process. Trevithick did not fare nearly as well, though he later found other uses for the high-pressure steam engine, including rock boring, dredging, and agriculture. He died penniless.
What was ABSCAM?
ABSCAM was an undercover operation conducted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, to ferret out corrupt government officials and prosecute them. In 1978, agents began posing as American representatives of Arab businessmen whose company, the fictitious Abdul Enterprises Limited, was willing to buy political influence in the United States. ABSCAM comes from the first 2 letters of the business name, with the word scam added to the end. The trap was set. The first to be caught was Congressman Michael Ozzie Myers, 1943, of Pennsylvania, who was videotaped accepting a $50,000 bribe and saying, "I'm going to tell you something real simple and short. Money talks in this business." Other officials also fell prey to the sting operation. All of them were arrested on charges of bribery and conspiracy. The first of 7 trials got underway in 1980. None of the officials were acquitted. Most faced fines and or imprisonment, and all of them lost their offices. The wide net cast by ABSCAM had caught 1 U.S. Senator, 6 representatives in Congress, 1 mayor, 3 members of the Philadelphia City Council, 1 INS. Immigration and Naturalization Service inspector, 1 lawyer, 1 accountant, and many of their associates. The FBI operation and the resulting trials and punishments sent a loud warning to any public official subject to influence.
What was the trial of the 20th century?
As the century drew to a close, American historians, legal experts, and the public considered which of the many trials hailed as the trial of the 20th century actually was. But the criteria used by each person varied. Some believed the most important trial was the most highly publicized. Others believed it was a trial in which the verdict affected everyone. Some thought it was a trial that most epitomized an era. And some believed the most important trial was the one that inspired the most public debate. Still others looked for a single trial that seemed to have it all. Notoriety, impact, reflections of society at large, and a controversial outcome. Among the courtroom dramas that were mentioned were, the 1907 to 1908 trial of Harry Thaw, 1871 to 1947. Whose lawyers went through two trials. The first ended in a deadlocked jury, to convince jurors that Mr. Thaw suffered from dementia Americans, a condition supposedly unique to American men. That had caused Thaw to experience an uncontrollable desire to kill a man who had had an affair with his wife. The case took innocent by reason of insanity to new heights. The well-to-do, Harvard-educated Thaw was declared not guilty. The 1921 case of Nicola Sacco, 1891 to 1927, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, 1888-1927. Italian-born anarchists charged with and, amidst international uproar, found guilty of murder and robbery. So many people were convinced of the pair's innocence that demonstrations were mounted in cities around the world. They were executed in August 1927, but 50 years later Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts signed a special proclamation clearing their names. The Bruno Richard Hauptmann, 1899 to 1936, trial of 1935. The German-born defendant was convicted of murdering the 20-month-old son of celebrated aviator Charles A. Lindbergh, 1902 to 1974, and his noted wife Anne Morrow Lindbergh, 1906 to 2001. After the child was kidnapped from the family's Hopewell, New Jersey home on March 1, 1932. For 2.5 months, the world had prayed for the safe return of Charles Jr. But the toddler's body was found on May 12, 2 miles from the Lindbergh home. Public outrage demanded justice. Evidence surfaced that implicated Hauptmann, who was tried January 2 to February 13, 1935. Found guilty, he died by electrocution. Influential journalist H. L. Mencken noted that the trial, in which the conviction seemed to hinge on circumstantial evidence and which was attended by a circus-like atmosphere, was the biggest story since the resurrection. Though many remained convinced that officials had acted hastily to bring a case against Hauptmann, and maintained that he'd been framed, efforts to clear his name continued to be denied into the 1990s. The 1931 to 1937 trials of the so-called Scottsboro Boys, 9 men, ranging in age from 12 to 20, who had been seized from several points along a 42-car train in northeastern Alabama and were promptly charged with raping 2 white women. Upon medical examination, the women showed no signs of having been raped or even of having had intercourse in the time frame in question. Nevertheless, the court of public opinion in the segregated South saw to it that 8 of the 9 were convicted of the crime. In spite of overwhelming evidence and testimony supporting their innocence. The 1995 case of former football player O.J. Simpson, 1947. who was tried and acquitted in the murders of his former wife, Nicole, and her friend, Ronald Goldman. One observer said this trial had it all: women, minorities, public interest, domestic violence. Fallen hero, and through its live media coverage had exposed the legal system to the public. Other trials routinely mentioned in considering the question included the cases of convicted murderers Leopold and Loeb. The infamous Scopes monkey trial, which pitted faith against reason, religion against science, and tradition against modernity, the Nuremberg trials, which established a process that brought war criminals to justice, the case of Alger Hiss, who was either a traitor or the victim of a framing for political advantages at the highest levels, and the Rosenberg espionage case. Undoubtedly there are trials missing from even this long list. There can be no definitive answer to the question.
What are England's royal houses?
England's royal houses are simply families, including ancestors, descendants, and kin. Since 1066 England's rulers have come from a series of 10 royal houses: Normandy, ruled 1066 to 1135, Blois 1135 to 54, Plantagenet, 1154 to 1399, Lancaster, 1399 to 1471, York, 1471 to 85, Tudor, 1485 to 1603, Stuart, 1603 to 49, restored 1660 to 1714, Hanover, 1714 to 1901, Saxe-Coburg, 1901 to 10, and Windsor, 1910 to present. Prior to the establishment of the House of Normandy, England had been ruled by Saxons and Danes since 802. The first king of the House of Normandy was William I, also known as William the Conqueror c. 1028 to 1087, who was the son of the French Duke of Normandy. William invaded England in 1066 on the death of Edward the Confessor and the accession of Harold II. c. 1022 to 1066. Ousting Harold, William was coronate at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day. William's grandson, Stephen, was all that consisted of the short-lived reign of the House of Blois. Named such since Stephen was the Count of Blois and Chartres. Though he was raised in the court of his uncle, King Henry I, whom he succeeded. The House of Plantagenet, also called the House of Anjou, included the 10-year reign 1189 to 99, of Richard I, or Richard the Lion-Hearted, 1157 to 1099, who fought his father Henry II, 1068 to 1135, and his brothers for control of the throne. Richard's military prowess made him the hero of romantic legends. Thereafter, two contending branches of the House of Plantagenet, the houses of Lancaster and York, vied for the crown in the infamous War of the Roses, 1455 to 85. The struggle finally ended when Henry VII, a Lancaster, ascended the throne and married into the House of York, reuniting the two sides of the family under the newly minted House of Tudor. The Tudors were a famous lot, remembered for the reigns of Henry VIII. 1509 to 47, and his daughters, Mary I, 1553 to 1558, and Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603. The Tudors were followed by the Stuarts, whose reign was interrupted by the establishment of the Commonwealth and Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658. The house was restored to power, giving history the 8-year period known as the Restoration. In 1660, it was King William III, 1650 to 1702, a Stuart, and Queen Mary II. 1662 to 1694, who began in 1689 to rule England in a more modern fashion through Parliament. A Stuart descendant, George I, 1660 to 1727, established the House of Hanover, which originated in Germany. Queen Victoria, 1819 to 1901, who presided over the Victorian Age, 1837 to 1901, was of the House of Hanover. She was succeeded by her son, Edward VII, 1841 to 1910, who established the House of Saxe-Coburg. Technically, this is the royal house still at the helm today. The name was changed to Windsor during World War I, 1914 to 18.
What are greenbacks?
Greenbacks are the paper money printed and issued by the U.S. government during the Civil War. The financial demands of the war quickly depleted the nation's supply of specie, gold and silver. In response, the government passed the Legal Tender Act of 1862, which suspended specie payments and provided for the issue of paper money. Legal tender is money that must be accepted in payment of any debt. Since the bills were supported only by the government's promise to pay, it was somewhat derisively observed that they were backed only by the green ink they were printed with. Hence the name greenbacks. The value of the notes depended on the people's confidence in the U.S. government and its future ability to convert the currency to coin. As the fighting between the Union and the Confederacy raged, Americans' confidence in their government fluctuated. When the Union suffered defeat, the value of the greenbacks dropped one time to as low as 35 cents on the dollar. Greenbacks remained in circulation after the fighting ended, finally regaining their full value in 1878. After the financial crisis in 1873, many people, particularly Western farmers, clamored for the government to issue more. Advocates of the monetary system formed the Greenback Party, which was active in American politics. Between 1876 and 1884, they believed that by putting more greenbacks into circulation, the U.S. government would make it easier for debts to be paid and prices would go up, resulting in prosperity. The country's present-day system of paper money is based on the government's issue of notes, which was made necessary by the Civil War.
Were any countries besides Switzerland neutral during World War II?
Yes, in its official stance of neutrality, Switzerland was joined by Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Turkey, and Argentina. However, post-war findings indicated the neutrality of these countries, with the exception of Argentina, was not an absolute policy. Some have described these countries as only nominally neutral. A 1998 report released by U.S. Undersecretary of State Stuart Eizenstat indicated that the Swiss had converted Nazi gold to Swiss francs, and that Germany had used that exchange to buy minerals from Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and Turkey. The report further pointed out that Sweden had allowed 250,000 Nazi troops to cross its country in order to reach neighboring Finland, where the Germans fought Soviet forces. Eisenstadt, who headed a U.S. government effort to determine where Nazi gold ended up, was assisted in his research by State Department historians. Although the investigation's reports were critical of these neutral countries, Eisenstadt also pointed out that all the countries were in difficult positions during the conflict. For example, Switzerland was completely surrounded by German-occupied countries. Nevertheless, Jewish groups brought lawsuits against the Swiss government and 3 Swiss banks for their role in converting looted Nazi gold into currency during World War II.
When did the first jet airplane take flight?
The aviation event took place in 1939 in Germany, just as World War II was beginning. The development of the jet aircraft was made possible by British inventor Frank Whittle. 1907 to 1996, who built the first successful jet engine in 1937, the Germans copied Whittle's design. The engine propels an object forward by discharging a jet of heated air or exhaust gases rearward. Whittle's company, Power Jets Limited, built the engine for Britain's first jet plane in 1941, which became the model for early U.S. jets. During World War II, Great Britain, the United States, and Germany all employ jets, though in limited numbers, in their military operations. After the war ended, 1945, aircraft manufacturers began developing jet airliners. The innovator in the field was the de Havilland Aircraft Company, founded 1920, which produced the Comet, the first commercial jet. The aircraft was used by British Overseas Airways Corporation, now British Airways, which in 1952 initiated passenger flights. But flaws in the Comet's structure were later discovered to be the cause of several mid-air explosions. The craft was redesigned, and in 1958 British Airways launched transatlantic passenger service using the improved Comets. U.S. jet airplane passenger service was introduced by American Airlines in 1959. The airline used the Boeing Company's 707 to transport passengers from New York City to Los Angeles.
What was the biggest gold rush?
The greatest American gold rush began on January 24, 1848, when James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California. Within a year, a large-scale gold rush was on. As the nearest port, the small town of San Francisco grew into a bustling city as fortune seekers arrived from around the world. Due to the influx, by 1850 California had enough people to qualify it for statehood. This pattern repeated itself elsewhere in the American West, including the Pikes Peak Gold Rush in 1859, which effectively launched the city of Denver, Colorado. The gold rush led to the discovery of copper, lead, silver, and other useful minerals. It also spawned related industry. One of the success stories is that of Levi Strauss, 1829 to 1902. A Bavarian immigrant who in 1853 began making and selling sturdy clothing to miners in San Francisco. In other countries, gold rushes had the same effect on the growth and development of regions. After the precious metal was discovered in Australia in 1851, the country's population almost tripled over the course of the next decade. The effect of an 1861 gold rush in nearby New Zealand was to double the country's population in 6 years' time. An 1886 discovery in South Africa led to the development of the city of Johannesburg. Just over a decade later, the infamous Yukon Gold Rush in the Klondike region of Canada spurred development there.
What was the War of Reform?
It was the period in Mexican history from 1858 to 1861 when the Federalist government collapsed and civil war ensued. In 1858 President Ignacio Comonfort, 1812 to 1863, who had become Mexico's leader when he helped overthrow President Antonio López de Santa Anna, 1794 to 1876, in 1855, felt political pressure and fled the country. Benito Juarez, 1806 to 1872, who had served as Minister of Justice and Minister of the Interior, assumed the presidency. His position was immediately opposed by Centralists who rallied around rebellious army forces. Under this pressure, the Federalists, led by Juarez, withdrew from Mexico City and set up the capital at Veracruz, on the Gulf Coast. There they had control over customs receipts, which allowed them to purchase arms and finance their government. Eventually they defeated the Centralists and re-entered Mexico City in January 1861. Juarez was elected president later that year, but his authority was challenged again with the arrival of the French, who quickly put Maximilian, 1832 to 1867, in power as Emperor of Mexico. Juarez led the country in a successful campaign against the French, who were expelled in 1867 when Juarez resumed the presidency. He died in office in 1872.
Who were the code talkers?
Code talkers were Navajo Indians who provided secure communications for the U.S. military-specific operations during World War II, 1939–45. Serving in the Marines, the Navajo servicemen were recruited because of their language, which is unwritten and extremely complex. Military officials believed the Japanese would not be able to decipher intercepted communiques that were transmitted in the Navajo language. The first Navajo recruits attended boot camp in May 1942 and developed and memorized a dictionary of military terms to use in encrypting messages. The trained code talkers were deployed with Marine units throughout the Pacific Theater. They worked around the clock, with tremendous speed and accuracy, to transmit vital information about military tactics, battle orders, and troop movements. Their messages were sent over telephone and radio, because of the complexity of the language. The Japanese military was never able to break the code. About 400 Navajos served as code talkers during the war, contributing mightily to the success of U.S. military assaults at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and other Pacific venues.
When did American poetry begin?
As the self-described poet of democracy, Walt Whitman, 1819–1892, was the first to compose a truly American verse, one that showed no references to European antecedents, throwing off both the narrative and ode forms of verse, and that clearly articulated the American experience. His first published poetry was the self-published collection Leaves of Grass, 1855. In an effort to gain recognition, Whitman promptly sent a copy to the preeminent man of American letters, Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803–82, who could count as his acquaintances and friends the great British poets William Wordsworth, 1770–1850, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772–1834, the renowned Scottish essayist Thomas Carlyle, 1795–1881. And prominent American writers Henry David Thoreau, 1817–1862, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, 1804–1864. It was a bold move on Whitman's part, but it paid off, while Leaves of Grass had been unfavorably received by reviewers. Emerson composed a 5-page tribute, expressing his enthusiasm for the poetry and remarking that Whitman was at the beginning of a great career. Thoreau, too, praised the work. More than a century later, biographer Justin Kaplan acclaimed that in its time Leaves of Grass was the most brilliant and original poetry yet written in the New World. At once the fulfillment of American literary romanticism and the beginnings of American literary modernism. Whitman's well-known and frequently studied poems include Song of Myself, O Captain, My Captain, Song of the Open Road, and I Sing the Body Electric. While she was virtually unknown for her poetry during her lifetime, Emily Dickinson, 1830 to 1886, was writing at about the same time as Whitman, the 1850s, publishing only a handful of poems before her death. Collections of Dickinson's works were published posthumously, and today she, too, is regarded as one of the great early poets of the United States. Had more of her work been brought out in print, perhaps she would have been recognized as the first truly American poet.
How did the birth control movement get started?
The decline in death rates, which has meant an overall increase in the world population, gave rise to the birth control movement. Scientific advances during the 18th and 19th centuries resulted in better food supplies, the control of diseases, and safer work environments for those living in developed countries. These improvements combined with progress in medicine to save and prolong human lives. During the 1800s, the birth rate, which in earlier times had been offset by the death rate, became a concern to many who worried that population growth would outstrip the planet's ability to provide adequate resources to sustain life. In 1798, British economist and sociologist Thomas Robert Malthus, 1766 to 1834, published his essay on the principle of population, arguing that populations tend to increase faster than do food supplies. He thereby concluded that poverty and suffering are unavoidable. Malthus viewed only war, famine, disease, and moral restraint as checks on population growth. In spite of or because of Malthus's assertions, during the 1800s the idea of birth control as a practical method to keep population growth in check gained momentum. Early in the 1900s the movement found a leader in American Margaret Higgins Sanger, 1883 to 1966, whose personal experience as a nurse working among the poor had convinced her that limiting family size is necessary for social progress. She became convinced that unwanted pregnancy should be avoided by using birth control methods. It was and remains controversial. Even though the distribution of birth control information was illegal at the time, Sanger advised people on the subject. In 1914 she founded a magazine called The Woman Rebel, and she sent birth control information through the mail. She was arrested and indicted. But she was not deterred. In 1916 in Brooklyn, New York, Sanger founded the first birth control clinic in the United States. In 1921 she organized the first American birth control conference, held in New York. That same year she founded the American Birth Control League, which later became the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. As public support for the movement increased, Sanger succeeded in getting laws passed that allowed doctors to disseminate birth control information to their patients. In other countries, Sanger's work inspired similar movements. but developed nations continue to have lower birth rates than do developing nations. With the world population exceeding 5.5 billion. The fear of overpopulation had prompted new interest in birth control.
Why is the Globe Theatre famous?
The Globe is known because of William Shakespeare's, 1564–1616, involvement in it. In the 1590s, an outbreak of the plague prompted authorities to close London theatres. At the time, Shakespeare was a member of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, an acting company. With other members of the troupe, he helped finance the building of the Globe. On the banks of the Thames River, which opened in 1599 as a summer playhouse. Plays at the Globe, then outside of London proper, drew good crowds. And the Lord Chamberlain's Men also gave numerous command performances at court for King James. By the turn of the century, Shakespeare was considered London's most popular playwright. And by 1603 the acting group, whose summer home was the Globe Theatre, was known as the King's Men.
Why was the Dred Scott decision important?
The decision in the case of Dred Scott pronounced the Missouri Compromise. 1820, unconstitutional and served to deepen the divide between North and South, helping pave the way for the Civil War, 1861–65. In the mid-1800s, Dred Scott, c. 1795–1858, who had been born into slavery in Virginia, tried to claim his freedom on the basis that he had traveled with his owner, a doctor. In Wisconsin and Illinois, where slavery had been prohibited by the Missouri Compromise. By the Compromise, Congress decided to admit Missouri as a slavery state and Maine as a free state, and declared that the territories north of the 36th parallel, present-day Missouri's southern border, were free, with the exception of the state of Missouri. After a lifetime of slavery, Dred Scott sued Missouri for his freedom in April 1846. The case, which hinged on Scott's travels in free territories in the North, went through 2 trials. The second was granted due to a procedural error in the first. In 1850, at the conclusion of the second trial, a Missouri jury ruled Scott a free man based on precedents that indicated residence in a free territory or state resulted in emancipation, regardless of the fact that Missouri itself was a slave state. John F. A. Sanford, the lawyer for Scott's owner, immediately appealed the decision before the Missouri Supreme Court, where a pro-slavery judge reversed the ruling, rescinding Scott's freedom. But the case was not over yet, because Sanford had filed the court papers under his own name rather than that of Scott's former owner, the case of Scott v. Sanford. Because of a filing error, the case is also rendered as Scott v. Sanford, took an interesting twist. Scott hired a new lawyer who was able to get the case before the federal court. Sanford had moved to New York, and since the appellant, Scott, and the registered defendant, Sanford, were now residents of different states. The case came under federal purview. In 1854 a circuit court in St. Louis again heard Dred Scott's case, but his freedom was again denied. This decision was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which began hearing the case in 1856. In March 1857 the Supreme Court, which had a Southern majority, ruled that Scott's residence in Wisconsin and Illinois did not make him free, that a black, a Negro descended from slaves, had no rights as an American citizen and therefore could not bring suit in a federal court, and that Congress never had the authority to ban slavery in the territories. Dred Scott died the following year.
How old is biological warfare?
Biological or germ warfare has a long history. For example, in the year 1343, Tatars, originally a nomadic tribe of East Central Asia, became sick with the bubonic plague. The disease, which is carried by fleas and rats, was called the Black Death because nearly all who became afflicted died. Invading the Crimea, in present-day Ukraine, the marauding Tatars encountered a group of Genos, Italian, merchants at a trading post. Besieging them, the Tatars catapulted their dead at their enemy, many of whom became infected, carrying the plague to Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey, and to the Western European ports where they traveled. In the 20th century, the use of microorganisms or toxins that produce sickness in people or in animals, or that cause destruction to crops, was outlawed by the Geneva Gas Protocol of 1925. In 1972 the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention was simultaneously opened for signature in Moscow, Washington, and London, and the agreement entered into force on March 26, 1975. Signed by more than 162 nations. The convention bans the development, production, stockpiling, acquisition, and retention of microbial or other biological agents or toxins, in types and in quantities that have no justification for prophylactic, protective, or other peaceful purposes. Nevertheless, several nations have conducted further research into defense against biological warfare, including developing microorganisms suitable for military retaliation. The existence of such biological weapons including anthrax and smallpox remains a concern today. The possibility that Iraq possessed biological and chemical weapons of mass destruction was the primary reason for the U.S.-led invasion of that country in 2003.
How old is the Great Wall of China?
The immense structure, built as a barricade of protection against invasion, was begun during the 3rd century B.C. by Emperor Shi Huangti, Cheng, c. 259 to 210 BC, of the Chen dynasty, and was expanded over the course of succeeding centuries. The wall stretches 1,500 miles, ranges in height between 20 to 50 feet, and is between 15 and 25 feet thick. In the 13th century, the wall was penetrated when Mongols conquered China, expanding their empire across all of Asia.
What was the Counter-Reformation?
Also called the Catholic Reformation, it was the Roman Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Some parishioners and members of the Roman Catholic clergy had already been calling for reforms within the Church for more than 2 centuries when in 1517 German monk and theology professor Martin Luther 1483 to 1546, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg, Saxony, Germany. His theses attacked the doctrines and authority of the Church, sparking the Reformation. The movement's leaders, called Protestants because they protested against the Catholic Church, changed the religious landscape of Europe by creating new Christian churches. But a movement to make changes inside the Catholic Church also began. The turning point came in 1534 when Paul III, 1468 to 1549, became Pope. Realizing that the Church must respond to what it viewed as a religious crisis, Pope Paul convened the Council of Trent, in Italy, which was charged with reviewing all aspects of religious life. The ecumenical group met from 1545 to 1547, 1551 to 1552, and 1562 to 1563. And out of those deliberations emerged the modern Catholic Church. The Counter-Reformation was aided by a group of priests and brothers known as the Jesuits. Members of the Society of Jesus, a religious order of the Roman Catholic Church. The Jesuits were instrumental in spreading the word of the reforms and in promoting a new spirit within the Catholic Church.
What is the Protestant ethic?
The Protestant ethic is a term describing a set of attitudes fostered by the leaders of the Reformation. Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546, John Calvin, 1509 to 1564. John Knox, 1513 to 1572, Huldrych Zwingli, 1484 to 1531, Conrad Grebel, c. 1498 to 1526, and their Protestant successors such as Methodist Church founders John Wesley, 1703 to 1791, and Charles Wesley, 1707 to 1788. These church leaders stress the holiness of a person's daily life, the importance of pastors to lead family lives, versus the celibacy of Catholic monks and nuns, education and study, and personal responsibility. According to these beliefs, the person who is hardworking, thrifty, and honest is a good person of value to their community and to God. From 1904 to 1905, German sociologist Max Weber, 1864 to 1920, wrote an essay called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, asserting that Protestant principles contributed to the growth of industry and commerce during the 1700s and 1800s, since the hard work, investment, and savings of individuals help build a capitalist economy.
What is the social contract?
The social contract is the concept that human beings have made a deal with their government. And within the context of that agreement, both the government and the people have distinct roles. The theory is based on the idea that humans abandoned a natural, free and ungoverned state in favor of a society that provides them with order, structure, and, very importantly, protection. Through the ages, many philosophers have considered the role of both the government and its citizens within the context of the social contract. In the theories of English philosopher John Locke, 1632 to 1704, the social contract was inextricably tied to natural law, the theory that some laws are fundamental to human nature. Locke argued that people first lived in a state of nature, where they had no restrictions on their freedom. Realizing that conflict arose as each individual defended his or her own rights, the people agreed to live under a common government, which offers them protection. But in doing so they had not abandoned their natural rights. On the contrary, argued Locke, the government should protect the rights of the people, particularly the rights of life, liberty, and property. Locke put these ideas into print, publishing his two most influential works in 1690. Essay Concerning Human Understanding and two treatises of government. These works firmly established him as the leading philosopher of freedom. His writings profoundly influenced Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826. Author of the Declaration of Independence, 1776, which asserts that there are self-evident truths, natural laws, that people are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, natural rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, one of the great figures of the Enlightenment. A cultural period of the 17th and 18th centuries, during which reason was celebrated as a superior human virtue, later published a book on the subject of the social contract. In his book titled Social Contract, 1762, he wrote that people enter into a binding agreement among themselves, and it is incumbent upon them to establish their government and government systems. According to Rousseau, people have a duty to obey only legitimate powers, meaning that only the people can decide who governs them. Rousseau's ideas helped promote the causes of the French Revolution. 1789 to 99, and the American Revolution, 1775 to 83. The concept of the social contract as defined by Rousseau materialized in the Declaration of Independence. 1776, which proclaims that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. The well-known words of the American's Creed, written in 1917 by William Tyler Page, 1868 to 1942, of Maryland, also asserts these principles: I believe in the United States of America as a government of the people, by the people, for the people, whose just powers are derived from the consent of the governed.
What is the Palestine Liberation Organization?
It is a group formed in 1964 by Arabs in Palestine, a region coextensive with the nation of Israel. Known as the PLO, the organization seeks to establish an area of self-rule for Muslims. Dominated by then guerrilla leader Yasser Arafat, 1929 to 2004. The PLO regarded Israel as an illegitimate state and became determined to establish a Palestinian state in the region. In 1974 the PLO was recognized by the United Nations and by Arab countries as the governing body of the Palestinian people. However, the Palestinians remained without a homeland and continued to fight for one, often resorting to terrorist tactics. In 1993 Israel and the PLO, still under Arafat's leadership, officially recognized each other. In an internationally brokered agreement, Israel agreed that by early 1996 it would withdraw its troops from the Gaza Strip, a tiny ribbon of land along the Mediterranean and bordering Egypt, and most cities and towns of the West Bank, a larger region lying west of the Jordan River and Dead Sea. The city of Jerusalem, recognized by both Israelis and Palestinians as their capitals, straddles the western border of the West Bank and is divided into an Arab East Jerusalem and a Jewish Israeli West Jerusalem. The 1993 Arab-Israeli Agreement, called the Oslo Accords, effectively carved out an autonomous Palestinian homeland, or at least an autonomous region. To govern this region, the Palestinian Authority, PA, was set up. In 1994 Arafat and Israeli leaders Yitzhak Rabin, 1922 to 1995, and Shimon Peres, 1923, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. In January 1996 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian-controlled parts of the West Bank elected a legislature and a president, Arafat, to govern these areas. But the accords foundered, both sides contributed to an escalation of violence in the long-troubled region. In 2003 the Roadmap for Peace, developed by the United States, in cooperation with Russia, the European Union, and the United Nations, was presented to Israel and the Palestinian Authority, PA. The plan outlined clear goals and timelines for their achievement for both sides. Still the violence continued, with both sides failing to take the reciprocal steps necessary to peaceably coexist in the region. Cautious hopes for peace were again raised in February 2005 when Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas, who in January succeeded Arafat, and Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon met at an Egyptian resort for summit talks. The two announced a verbal ceasefire pledge. Sharon promised that the Israeli military would end assaults on Palestinians, and Abbas vowed to bring an end to militant attacks on Israelis. But there were obstacles to the agreement. Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip and West Bank needed to be dismantled. The Palestinians needed to gain control of the militant group Hamas, responsible for hundreds of acts of terrorism against Israelis, and the Israeli military needed to step down its responses. The Palestinian government remained tied to the PLO.
Where does golf sensation Tiger Woods rank among the greats?
Woods, 1975, ranks among the best players of all time. In 1999 he won 8 tournaments, including the Professional Golfers Association, PGA, and Tour Championships, and he was the first player to win 4 consecutive starts since Ben Hogan. 1912 to 1997, in 1953, Hogan won a total of 5 tournaments that year. In 2000 Woods went on to win 9 tournaments, and in 2001 and 2002 he had 5 wins each season, giving him a total of 27 wins in 4 years. In July 2005, with his victory at the British Open, Woods became only the 5th player in golf history to complete a career Grand Slam, winning golf's 4 major tournaments: the Masters, the US Open, the British Open, and the PGA Championship. In 2001 he became the first player to consecutively win the Grand Slam. This impressive run alone assures Woods a place in the annals of golf history. As of mid-2005 Arnold Palmer, 1929, remained the PGA leader for the number of wins in any 4-year period. Between 1960 and 1964 he racked up 29 first-place finishes. He was also the first player to win the Masters 4 times, 1958, 1960, 1962, and 1964. A couple of other legendary names in golf tallied record numbers of wins in short periods to dominate the sport. Ben Hogan won 30 tournaments in 3 seasons, 1946-48, and Byron Nelson, 1912. Won 26 tournaments in just 2 years, 1944 and 1945. Sam Snead, 1912-2002, and Jack Nicklaus, 1940. Dominated the sport over the course of decades. Snead holds the record for the most wins in a career, 81. And Nicklaus follows with 71. At the age of 24 Woods was already the PGA's career earnings leader. To put this in perspective, in 1999 he won $1 million more for the year than golf legend Jack Nicklaus made in his entire PGA Tour career. Woods' ability and appeal combined to help raise earnings overall for the sport. he was credited with expanding golf's horizons by bringing new fans to the game. According to ESPN the magazine, ratings for the final round of each of the four majors collectively jumped 56% in 1997 when Woods broke the Masters scoring record. He shot 270 over 72 holes to finish 12 strokes ahead of the second-place winner. At the end of the 2004 season and despite a slump, Woods remained on top for career earnings. But he was followed very closely by Vijay Singh, 1963.
What are the basic beliefs of Buddhism?
Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths: existence is suffering, the cause of suffering is desire. Through total transcendence, called nirvana, one may suspend suffering. And to end suffering one must follow a certain path called the Eightfold Noble Path. The path prescribes moral conduct, specifically, 1. Knowing the truth, 2. Resolving to resist evil, 3. Using speech properly so as not to hurt others, 4. Demonstrating respect for life, morality, and property through one's actions, 5. Working in a job that does not harm others, 6. Making an effort to free one's mind of evil, 7. Mindfulness, or controlling one's thoughts and feelings, and 8. Concentration. In some places, the beliefs and practices of Buddhism are combined with those of Hinduism and the Shinto religion.
Who invented the television?
The television, which may seem to many to be a decidedly American invention, was actually the outcome of a series of inventions by a cast of international characters. As early as 1872, British engineer Willoughby Smith, 1828 to 1891, inspired by an experiment on selenium rods, imagined a system of visual telegraphy. 5 years later, the tube technology that would make television possible was developed in Strasbourg by German physicist Carl Ferdinand Braun, 1850 to 1918. He invented a cathode ray tube, also known as the Braun tube, which improved the Marconi wireless radio technology by increasing the energy of sending stations, and arranged antennas to control the direction of radiation. In 1907, Russian physicist Boris Rosing proposed using Braun's tube to receive images, something he called electric vision. 1 year later, Alan Campbell Swinton, 1863 to 1930, suggested using the cathode ray tube to both receive and transmit images. That same year, the idea of using cathode ray tubes to scan images for the purpose of television was published, and by 1912 it was being worked on by Rosing and his former pupil Vladimir Zworykin, 1889 to 1982, in Russia. In 1923, a competing technology, which was entirely mechanical, reached an early milestone when British inventor John Logie Baird, 1888 to 1946, demonstrated an electrified hatbox with discs, which constituted the world's first working television set. But the race was still on, and in that same year, Zworykin, who had moved to the United States in 1919 and was hired by Westinghouse Electronic Corporation, in 1920, advanced the tube-based technology when he patented the iconoscope, which would become the television camera. In 1929, Zworykin, now a U.S. citizen, invented the kinescope, television tube. Zworykin's inventions together comprised the first electronic television. Regularly scheduled U.S. television began on April 30, 1939, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, opened the New York World's Fair, billed as the World of Tomorrow, giving a speech that was the first televised presidential talk. The national broadcasting company's, NBC, coverage of the fair's opening initiated its weekly television scheduling. A victory for parent company RCA, whose president, David Sarnoff, 1891 to 1971, founded NBC and is considered a broadcasting pioneer.
How did the House of Tudor originate?
The name of a royal family that ruled England for well over a century, from 1485 to 1603, came from a Welshman, Owen Tudor, who sometime after 1422 married Catherine of Valois, 1401 to 1437, the widow of Henry V, who ruled from 1413 to 1422. The family did not come to power until Henry VII ascended the throne. Ruling from 1485 until his death in 1509, Henry VII, 1457 to 1509, ended the bitter 30-year War of the Roses, during which two noble families, the houses of Lancaster and York, had struggled against each other for control of the throne. The conflict earned its name since the badge of each house depicted a rose, one red and the other white. In taking power, Henry VII became the head of the House of Lancaster, and in 1486 he married into the House of York, thus uniting the two former enemies and founding his own Tudor dynasty. He's known as Henry Tudor.